Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In this episode, I want to provide you with an update on the response from the Russian population to President Putin's recent announcement that he is looking to mobilize 300,000 people to send to Ukraine to keep the war going. So if you've been following the channel, you'll be aware that although the President Putin directive stated that the 300,000 people would only be reservists, so people who'd previously signed up to join the military, reports were coming out from Russia that actually this was forming into more of a general conscription. And there were a lot of reports that men were being taken from the streets and forced to go and fight in Ukraine. And news of this caused mass panic and has resulted in a mass exodus of men from Russia over the course of the last week or so. So in this episode today, we'll have a look at where all of these people are going, which countries they're fleeing to, and how many have actually crossed the border so far. We'll talk about Russia's response to this, because they've been sending roaming mobilization units to actually capture people at the borders. And then I want to talk through the financial implications of this, because we've talked about the brain drain before. Since the war started on the 24th of February, over 500,000 people are reported to have left Russia. And this brain drain is having a highly detrimental impact on the Russian economy because the people who are leaving are generally the higher educated, the higher skilled, and the more senior people in companies. So over the last 7 months or so, we've seen a lot of these people leaving. And this mobilization call is accelerating people leaving the country and also people leaving their jobs. So we'll go through the implications of that for the Russian economy. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications for Russia are of this mobilization effort, what it means in terms of when the war is likely to end, and what the implications of all of this are for the global economy. So before we get started on all of that, if I could ask you to give me a thumbs up at some point during this video if you're enjoying the content. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. I'm on that push for 200,000 subscribers, so if you could help, that'd be fantastic. Don't forget, I always include chapters. I know this is a really popular feature amongst viewers. So if you don't have time to watch the entire video, you can still pick up the essence of what this story is about and get the essential information. And if you'd like to support the channel, please have a look below where you'll find links to YouTube Super Thanks and membership, as well as Buy Me a Coffee, Patreon and Amazon shopping links. Wednesday the 21st of September is considered by many people in Russia to be the turning point of the Ukraine war. Up until then, the conflict was referred to by President Putin as a special military operation, and it had relatively little impact on the residents of Russia. However, on the morning of the 21st of September, President Putin gave a live address to the country whereby he stated that 300,000 men were going to be called up in a mobilization effort to support the war effort and to replace some of the soldiers that have already been lost. Now, this is the first time since World War II, back in the 1940s, that Russia have called for a mobilization. And this sent shockwaves all across Russia because people suddenly realised that Russia is at war and it's losing people and needs to now call up 300,000 people to replace those that have been lost. But actually the messages that started to spread on social media were much worse than that, because within a couple of hours of this announcement, it started being reported that people who were not reservists and had no background whatsoever with the military were being called up. So ordinary people with ordinary jobs were receiving papers telling them that they had to report for military service the next day and that they would be going to Ukraine to fight in this war. And that caused a number of responses. Firstly, a lot of men of eligible age who were potentially going to be called up decided that they wanted to leave the country immediately. So we saw a huge increase in demand for flights out of Russia, and a lot of people got into their cars and drove to the nearest border that would allow them to leave the country permanently. We saw protests on the streets of Russia, and in many cases the police took a heavy-handed approach. They arrested people, they picked them up, they dragged them off to vans, and there were reports from human rights groups that many of the men who'd been arrested were conscripted and were going to be forced to go to Ukraine to fight. As news of this response from the authorities spread, the number of protests started to reduce significantly, and the number of people deciding to leave the country increased. Now, as I'm sure everybody who's watching this video will be aware, Europe has introduced a variety of sanctions against Russia, and many of the countries of Europe have closed their borders to Russian citizens, so the options are relatively limited if you want to leave the country right now. This map shows the majority of the borders that Russian citizens are considering crossing to try to leave the country. Now, clearly one of the biggest borders is with Ukraine, but it's unlikely that Russian citizens will want to get into their cars and drive across the border into Ukraine right now, given what's going on. Firstly, there is a lot of conflict going on, so they'd be driving into a war zone if they went to the east of the country. And secondly, they won't be very well received. It's very unlikely that Ukrainian citizens will be particularly welcoming towards Russians who are fleeing from President Putin's regime. Even if they do disagree with his politics, I don't think Ukrainians will be that interested in helping the Russians. Now, Belarus also has a large border with Russia, so this is a potential option. However, the problem of entering Belarus is that Belarus is a close ally of Russia. So close, in fact, that it allowed Russian forces to use the border between Belarus and Ukraine in their attempt to take the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, at the start of this war. Now, as a direct result of that action, Belarus has also been sanctioned alongside Russia. So those sanctions mean that it's difficult to actually leave Belarus. So there is a significant border between Belarus and Poland, but you won't be able to cross that because the Polish authorities have closed that border. The other problem with entering Belarus for Russian citizens is that it's been reported that the Russian military police have been given full license to go and arrest people and issue mobilization papers to anybody who's caught in Belarus. So going into Belarus isn't really a safe haven for Russians right now. As we move further north, the next two borders are Latvia and Estonia, both of which are members of the European Union. So potentially, if Russians entered these countries, they would then be able to move freely amongst all of the other EU countries. However, Estonia and Latvia closed their borders to Russian citizens a number of months ago, so they won't actually be allowed to cross the border unless they have a visa that allows them to enter the EU. But the majority of people looking to leave Russia won't have that paperwork and therefore will not be allowed to enter either of those countries. If we move further north again, one of the largest land borders that Russia has is with Finland. It's around 800 miles long, and Finland is still allowing Russians to enter the country. And I'll go into some detail later in this video as to how many Russians have entered Finland. Now, it's not actually visible on this map, but Russia does have a very small border with Norway, and there is one border crossing. And it's been reported that around 2,000 Russians have left the country to enter into Norway. Now, interestingly, Norway isn't a member of the EU, so entering Norway wouldn't allow you to then enter into all of the other countries in Europe, and you would need the visa to be able to make that crossing. So the Russians who are entering Norway will have some paperwork that allows them to enter the country. Moving back down south, there are two other borders here that I want to talk about. Kazakhstan, to the right-hand side of this map, has a significant land border and has been one of the most popular destinations for Russians leaving. So we'll go through that in a bit more detail in a moment. And Georgia, which is a former Soviet state, has also been a very popular destination. As I mentioned at the start of the video, when the announcement of mobilization was issued, there was a huge increase in demand for flights. Now, most European countries have closed their airspace to Russian aircraft. So the majority of these flights are going to Turkey, Armenia, Serbia, Azerbaijan and Montenegro. And it's been reported that over 40,000 Russians have left for Turkey in the last week or so, and thousands have been taking one-way tickets to all of these other destinations.
Long queues build up at the Vizhnevka border crossing from Russia to Kazakhstan as thousands continue to flee a possible call-up for the war in Ukraine. About 98,000 Russians have crossed into Kazakhstan in the last week, and those willing to testify are unambiguous about their motives for travelling. The mobilization was announced as partial, but according to the documents it appears to be full, says this man. And the president's words do not correspond to what is written on the paper. The people standing here are afraid that sooner or later a full mobilization will be announced, and then no one will be able to cross the borders. Some too are travelling by train. The price of taxis to the border has become unaffordable for most. Kazakhstan has promised not to send them back. The territorial integrity of states must be respected, said President Tokayev. I have always spoken about this openly and clearly in the international arena. Tokayev also said Kazakhstan won't recognize the referendums in Ukraine's occupied territories, a defiant stand from a country that's traditionally been seen as an ally of Moscow.
So Kazakhstan is the single most popular destination for Russians looking to leave the country right now. Around 15,000 Russians are making the crossing every single day into Kazakhstan. And I think it's really interesting to hear that the president of Kazakhstan is welcoming all of these people into the country. They won't be sent back, so there's no issue with regards to closing the border. And they've also come out and stated that they don't agree with the annexation of the 4 regions in Ukraine. So quite bold statements from Kazakhstan, particularly in view of the fact that it's got significant land borders with Russia. So there must be an element of concern in Kazakhstan right now that if they become too vocal and too negative towards what's happening in Ukraine, that they potentially could also be seen as a target by Russia, because Kazakhstan has huge amounts of natural resources. Georgia is the second most popular destination for Russians looking to emigrate, and around 10,000 are making the border crossing every single day. So it's estimated that around 70 or 80,000 have already crossed the border, and it's been reported that the traffic jams are now up to 10 miles long, and that people are abandoning their cars in those traffic jams and then doing the rest of the journey on foot, because they're all very concerned that they need to get to the border before Russia takes any decision with regards to closing all of these exits, because once that happens, there'll be no way out. And there's also been reports from the Georgian border of Russian military turning up with effectively roaming mobilization units. So they're checking the papers of any Russian men who are at that border, and if they're on the list for mobilization, they are basically taking them away and they will then be sent to Ukraine. So this is causing much concern amongst all of the Russians, because they are desperate to make that crossing to get out of Russia and to make sure that they don't get caught up in any form of mobilization.
At the land border with Finland, a long queue of Russian cars has lined up to cross. Finland is now Russia's last remaining EU neighbor that still allows the entry of Russian Schengen visa holders. But while Finland prepares to limit or ban the entry of Russian tourists, and as flights out of Moscow become unavailable, it may be now or never for those wanting to avoid the draft.
So as I mentioned earlier, Finland is the only country in the EU that's allowing any Russian citizens to enter. And it's been reported that over 40,000 Russians have so far made the crossing. And once they enter into Finland, then that potentially gives them the opportunity to move elsewhere in the EU. So this is really a stepping stone for a lot of these people. They probably won't stay in Finland. It's a relatively small country, only has a population of around 5 million people. And the Finnish authorities are considering whether or not they should continue allowing Russians to cross the border, or whether they should join all of the rest of the EU and close the entry to any Russian citizens. And the double threat of the border closure, either from Russia or from Finland, is causing people to get to that border as soon as possible. So we're seeing very large queues of traffic for people desperate to get out of Russia. Now, since the start of the Ukraine war, it's been reported that around 10 million Ukrainians have left the country and moved to other places in Europe. And a lot of countries are giving asylum, they're providing food and shelter and houses for people to live in. So it's been a really concerted effort. And a really interesting question here is, should the people who are fleeing Russia, the Russian citizens who don't agree with President Putin's politics or his mobilization, should they be offered the same form of asylum that is being offered to Ukrainians? And it's really interesting to note what Germany's position is on this matter. Germany's Interior Minister has stated that Germany is ready to grant asylum to Russian deserters who oppose their country's partial mobilization. She stated, "Deserters threatened with serious repression can, as a rule, obtain international protection in Germany. Anyone who courageously opposes Vladimir Putin's regime and therefore falls into great danger can apply for asylum on the grounds of political persecution." And these comments were supported by Justice Minister Marco Buschmann, who tweeted, "Anyone who hates Putin's path and loves liberal democracy is welcome in Germany." So I think this is a really interesting position that Germany are putting forward. They're encouraging people to actually leave Russia, to walk away from this regime. And I guess that really supports the whole concept of the brain drain and is anti-President Putin. Because you can't tarnish everybody with the same brush. Just because you were born in Russia and you're Russian doesn't mean that you believe in what President Putin is doing in Ukraine and that you support any of his policies. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, the police have taken a very heavy-handed approach to anybody who's protesting against what's happening with regards to the mobilization and the war in Ukraine. And that's obviously caused a massive reduction in the number of protests. But what we have started seeing are some violent incidents against the recruitment concept. This map of Russia shows the reported attacks on military recruitment offices. And we've got two different symbols here. The blue circles represent the number of attacks that were launched before the mobilization was announced, and the red triangles are the number after the mobilization. Now, clearly, in terms of timescales, the blue circles represent a period of around 7 months, and the red triangles represent a period of around 7 days. And you can see that since the mobilization was announced, there have been 18 recorded incidents of attacks on these offices. And these have been spread all across the country. So it's not the same group who's instigating the same attacks. This is different people, different groups, different individuals. And some of these attacks have been very serious. A 25-year-old Russian arrived with a gun at an enlistment office in Siberia and opened fire, leaving the official overseeing the draft hospitalized in a critical condition. And it's been reported that at least 20 military or administrative buildings across the country have been targeted by Molotov cocktails or arson attacks. One video which is circulating online, which I won't show you because YouTube has restrictions on these sort of videos, shows an individual deliberately blocking the entrance to an enlistment office with his car before throwing 5 Molotov cocktails into the building. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video really to provide everybody with an update to show that the mass exodus that we saw initially as soon as the mobilization was announced is still continuing. People are desperate to leave the country. And I think as time's gone on, a lot of individuals have realised that this mobilisation probably isn't limited to 300,000 reservists. And it's likely that people will be taken off the streets, out of their jobs, and be forced to go to Ukraine. And I think the underlying message that's being sent out is that President Putin is not prepared to lose this war at any cost. So the ground that they've lost recently to the Ukrainian forces, around 6,000 square kilometres, and all of the tanks and people that they've lost in those conflicts, he just wants to keep replenishing by calling up more and more people. So officially this is a call-up of 300,000 reservists. But where does it stop? When does it come to the point where President Putin decides that he doesn't need to call up more people? Well, if he wants to carry on with this war indefinitely, that means that he will need to call up an indefinite amount of people. And the open-ended nature of this conflict is what's causing real concern in Russia. So effectively what we're seeing here is President Putin accelerating the brain drain. We've already seen over 500,000 people leaving Russia because of the sanctions. And it's likely that over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, we will see millions of other people leaving Russia. And the people who are leaving generally are the more educated, the higher skilled, the more valuable members of society. The majority of the population of Russia don't hold international passports, so they will struggle to be able to leave the country. And the people who are holding those passports are generally the more mobile, the more educated, the people that Russia wants to retain. So from an economic point of view, what we're seeing here is Russia losing its most valuable resource, its people. Because going forward, it's going to need all of those people to get it through this really difficult period when the sanctions are applying against the country. I've mentioned it before, but Russia is struggling with regards to a lack of technology, and it will need its brightest people to be able to tackle all of these issues. So the fact that a lot of them are getting into their cars and driving over the border to get out of the country is really bad news for Russia. So if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, since the start of this war, we've seen over 1,000 companies exiting from Russia. They've either decided to close their operations down entirely, stop doing any trade, or stop making any future investments. So all of that business has been lost, and all of the people who are employed by those companies have generally left. Certainly all of the expats, the people who are overseas nationals who came to Russia, left very soon after the war started. We then saw the brain drain. So we saw all the highly intelligent and skilled people who saw the opportunities diminishing in Russia. They also left. So the Russian workforce is now diminishing, and the senior people that it needs are disappearing. And this is all coming at a time when severe sanctions have been applied against Russia. They've lost their closest markets in terms of all of those European markets for natural gas and oil. And whilst they're trying to replace that with India and China, It isn't as simple as that. If you follow the channel, you'll be fully aware that it's very difficult to be able to replace 95% of those gas sales because they've been sending it to Europe in a gaseous form. And in order to sell that gas to India, it's going to have to convert it into LNG. And Russia simply doesn't have the LNG facilities to be able to do that. So it's losing tens of billions of dollars of revenue. And in order to rebuild the economy, it would need all of its brightest people. And a large number of those brightest people no longer want to stay in the country because they run the risk of being conscripted and sent over to Ukraine. And the fact that President Putin has no interest in a peace settlement and it looks like he wants to take this war all the way could really be the end of Russia. This could result in the downfall of the Russian economy because if this carries on for a prolonged period, more and more people are going to leave and the economy is going to go to rack and ruin. So I'll keep you posted on the mass exodus that's being caused by this mobilization effort. My gut feel on this situation is that at some point Russia will close the internal borders. It will tell all of its citizens that you're not allowed to leave whilst this war is continuing. And that is going to cause even more panic and more concern and more issues for Russia. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it interesting, entertaining and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already.